Hi, my name is Andrew, and I'll be showing you how to play Eagles Waterloo. Eagles is a card game and a dice game that recreates the Battle of Waterloo. There are 300 cards in a complete set. Like any game about any battle, Eagles has to deal with issues of translating the battle to the game format. This includes units, fighting, commanders, and terrain. Let's start with the terrain. While some games use a map with a square grid imposed on the map to regulate movement, Eagles uses abstract table space. In front of each player is a representation of the battlefield. Each player has a reserve space, and this is where units are kept when not fighting. In front of that is a left wing, a center ring, and a right wing. The French player has a right wing to his right, a left wing to his left, and a center. The same goes for the Prussian or Anglo-Allied player. In between the players is a middle ground. The middle ground isn't an area for the purposes of the game, but just serves as a line for determining attacks and battles. For a few terrain features that were especially prominent in the battles of the Waterloo campaign, the creators of Eagles have created special terrain cards. For example, Hougoumont, which was prominent in the Battle of Waterloo, and Quatre Bras, which was prominent in the Battle of Quatre Bras, have their own cards. In addition, the units themselves, or the military groups that engaged in the battle, are also represented by cards. Finally, important persons that were present in the battles are represented by cards, and those cards have a picture of the relevant commander, like the Duke of Wellington. I'm going to explain the game in stages, so I may leave out some rules in the very beginning. And if you know how to play the game, you may be wondering why I've done this. But don't worry, we'll get all of the rules by the time we're finished with the game. First, let's discuss the cards in general. There are different colors. The lighter blue color cards belong to the French side. You can also tell the French cards from the imperial eagle that's in the top right corner of the cards. Also, the jackets of the men in the picture are generally blue with red and white facings. The rest of the cards belong to the Anglo-Allied or Prussian armies. Prussian units have a card with a deep blue background. They have a complex eagle surrounded by a laurel in the upper right-hand corner. The difference in the logo should make it easy to distinguish from the French and the Prussians. In the actual battle, Napoleon used the similarity of uniform color to try to deceive his own French troops into thinking that the Prussians were actually French reinforcements. The Anglo-Allied army is the only army with multiple background colors. British units and some German possessions have a red background with a lion logo in the upper right corner. Units of the Anglo-Allied army that are Dutch or Belgian units have an orange background with the W coat of arms in the upper right corner. This is a play on the Dutch ruler William of Orange. Finally, members of the King's German Legion that were neither Prussian nor owned by the crown have a black background and a skull and crossbones in the corner. Here comes the most important part, so pay close attention. This is how to read the actual unit cards. Each card has a combat value, or a CV, that corresponds to how many men would be in the unit. And each CV means how many dice you will actually roll when attacking. So a 3 CV means that you will roll 3 dice, and a 2 CV means that you will roll 2 dice. The morale value of the unit is represented by the letter next to the CV. A morale is the best, and D is the worst. In terms of the game, this represents which number on the dice will result in a defeat of the unit. For example, only a 5 or a 6 will rout an A, but more on that in a moment. The combat value and the morale is reversed at the bottom of the card so that your opponent can read the card when it's played. Finally, the type of unit is indicated both in the symbol next to the CV and in the picture in the center of the card. For example, the rectangle means infantry, triangle means artillery, yellow for horse, and red for foot, and circle means cavalry. So let's look at these cards as an example. This card is from the German Legion, and it's a rectangle, so it means that it is an infantry. This is a triangle, so it means that it is a horse artillery. It has a combat value of 3 and a morale of A. This has a combat value of 2 and a morale value of C, and it's a red triangle, so it's a foot artillery. And finally, the yellow circle means that it's cavalry and it has a 2 CV and a morale of B. Play proceeds in alternating player turns, with the French side going first. And the French player first checks his morale. In other words, any hits that the player has from the previous round, he has to check the morale of that unit by rolling the appropriate number of dice. Then, after checking morale, he can move his units and attack using firepower or shock power, but more on that later. Then he rolls any dice for the attacks that he's made and determines whether any result in an actual hit on an attacked unit. Finally, after the French player is done moving, he draws 2 cards from his reinforcement to replenish his deck. After that, the Anglo-Allied goes in the same exact manner. First, a morale check to see if any of the hits on his units result in a rout, then the actual attack phase, and then finally pulling 2 cards from his reinforcement into his reserve deck. Play proceeds indefinitely, French, Anglo-Allied, until the end of the game, until somebody's won. And you win by occupying one of your opponent's positions with none of your opponent's units in that position. So in other words, if an Anglo-Allied card is the only card in the French left position, the Anglo-Allied player wins. Now you know how to read the cards and the basic way the game is played. So now let's look at movement. I have 4 areas: right, center, left, and reserve. The cards in the stack over here are my reinforcements. Now there are certain paths you can travel. In essence, you cannot move left to right or right to left with any units. You can only move forward and back. So let's say you wanted to get this infantry over to the right side. What you would need to do is you would need to use 2 moves. First to your reserves, and then to the right side. So you have to come back to your side if you want to get anywhere and you're on the other side. So let's say this cavalry unit was over in the French right flank. He would need to come back 2 turns and then into the center or to the right. Everyone except cavalry and generals gets 1 move per turn. So infantry, foot artillery, and horse artillery can only move 1 area. Also, you don't have to move any units if you do not want to. Finally, any unit that fires cannot move except horse artillery. In sum, everyone can move only once and cannot fire on the same move. The exceptions are that cavalry can move 2 areas, and horse artillery can move and fire in the same turn. If you think about these rules and exceptions in terms of the actual battle, it may be easier to remember them. War is slow, and so it takes a long time to move and fire. But horse artillery can move and fire in the same turn because they can move faster than infantry. Cavalry, likewise, can move faster than an infantry unit, so they can move 2 spots in the same amount of time that it would take infantry to move 1 spot. Generals also. They are on a horse, so they can move 2 units more than the infantry can. Now let's talk about rules about stacking. This means that you cannot have more than 4 cards in any area. 4 of your own cards in any area. So, if you have 4 cards in any given area, that is all of the cards that you can have. However, generals, terrain, and special cards do not count toward your total. But only 1 general is allowed per area. Now let's talk about the actual fighting. That's done with firepower or shock power. Firepower is the rating on the card in the upper left-hand corner that follows the letter F. Shock power is the number that follows the S, and these operate in the same way. First, you want to target 1 enemy unit. So let's say that this cavalry unit is targeting this cavalry unit. There's one rule about targeting units. You cannot target a unit that's already been hit until all other units in the area have a hit on them. After you target a unit, you roll the number of dice that corresponds to your CV. And you hit the targeted unit if you roll a certain number. For example, here the firepower is 1. So you get a hit for every 6 you roll. If you had an F2, you would get a hit for every 5 or 6 that you rolled. If you get confused about what the firepower number means, just look at the cheat sheet for help. Now, in order to fight, units have to engage, and engaged units can find themselves fighting with either firepower or shock. Firepower and shock ratings are the two ways that the units engage in combat. For infantry or cavalry to engage in combat, it has to be in the same area. This makes sense because your guys with muskets and bayonets are going to need to be close to one another to fight. Of course, remember that infantry nor cavalry can move and fire or shock in the same turn. If a unit is in your area, you can fire on them immediately. If they're not, then you would have to use your artillery to fire at them across the middle ground. And if you wanted to fire on them with either cavalry or infantry, you would need to use a move to get across the middle line. Now, if you ever open the rules of the game, you'll notice rules that talk about engagement. Don't worry too much about this, just follow the rules as I've laid them out. Battle is complex, and this is especially true when we're talking about artillery. You'll notice that there are two little numbers next to F's on the cards. The top value is for long-range fire. That's when your artillery is on your side and firing across the middle ground onto your opponent's units. The bottom F is when you're firing on enemy units within the same area. Now let's talk about long-range fire. This occurs across the middle ground. But you cannot do this if there are enemy units in the same area as your artillery is firing, or if you have units in the targeted area. Modern artillery uses a much higher trajectory than Napoleonic artillery did. In Napoleon's day, artillery could pretty much just fire straight across. So in other words, it would be almost impossible to fire over your own units' heads, and it would be almost impossible to fire into an area where your units were and not accidentally hit them. The second F is for short-range fire on artillery. This happens if an enemy unit is in the area that you are in as well. Now, foot artillery cannot move into an area already containing enemy units. Therefore, short-range fire with foot artillery only occurs when your enemy is in your area. Foot artillery is so called because its crew would march on foot. The artillery machinery would still be carried by horses, but the fact that the crew walked on foot made the units relatively immobile. Horse artillery is special. It can move and fire in the same turn. You can use short or long range depending on the circumstances. The only wrinkle on horse artillery is that they cannot fire and then move, but they can move and then fire. Crewmen in a horse artillery unit were on horses, unlike in the foot artillery unit, and so the crewmen in the horse artillery unit had greater mobility. This feature of horse artillery is represented in the game by the horse artillery unit's ability to move and fire within the same turn. Now let's go to the fleeing portion of the game. This actually happens at the beginning of the turn. For all units that have hits, you will do a morale check, and each hit corresponds to one die being rolled. So in this case, we would roll 2 dice for this unit. You then look at the morale letter next to the CV, and that will tell you which numbers of the dice will result in the defeat of that unit. A unit with A morale only flees if the dice rolled is equal to 5 or 6. Units with B morale will flee if a 4, 5, or 6 is rolled on any one of the dice. Again, consult the cheat sheet for help.